Yeah, I'm doing 2 intro videos. Hello and welcome to my channel. I am Colleen Delaney, and of my 2 intro videos, this is the one about the reading portion of this channel. So to start, let me give you a little bit of background on me. I am an avid reader, but aren't we all? I studied English literature in college and I minored in history and philosophy. After I graduated, I worked in publishing for a very short period of time, like less than a year. And then I worked at an independent bookstore for about 4 years, got a master's degree for library science, and then switched to being a librarian. I am a children's librarian by trade, but this is not going to be just children's books. I will put some children's books in here, but it's really going to run the gamut of picture books through erotica. So this is not for your kids to watch, it's for the adult reader and the family to watch. When I was a librarian, I worked in both school and public libraries and thoroughly enjoy both of them. I'm not currently working in a library because I do have 4 small children and we are in the middle of a pandemic. I am home with my kids when they're not at school. I have 3-year-old twins who really only go to school a few hours a week. So I'm a mix of a stay-at-home mom, and I'm an author, and I'm a currently not working librarian. Instead of telling you what to expect from me in genre recommendations, I figured I would show you an example of the books that I love in each of the genres I read so you can see whether or not our tastes align. I'm also always looking for recommendations, so if you ever want to comment on a video and tell me, hey, I think you love this book, or hey, I'm an author and I wrote this book, throw it down there, I will check it out. Okay, well, we're going to start with romance. I do read many different genres, but I read the most romance. I went through my Goodreads yesterday just to kind of get an idea of how many books I read in each genre, and romance is the most. There are certain months where I can't read anything but romance because my life is stressful or it's really dreary, like in February and March here. I tend to only read romance, but we'll see. This year I might vary it up a little bit more for all you watchers. So, to start with romance, I like several different subgenres in romance, and I'm going to start with historical because historical is what introduced me to romance, and I don't think I'm alone in that. My favorite historical romance author is Tessa. I've read tons of her books. I own a lot of her books, but I've given the majority of them to my sister. So here's one I still have in my possession, Romancing the Duke. It's super fun. Her books are funny historical romances. She has great banter, great love stories. Can't recommend her enough. Other historical romance authors I love: Lisa Kleypas, Kerrigan Byrne, Sophie Jordan, Joanna Shupe I've recently gotten really into, Sarah McLean, Courtney Milan, and there's plenty more, but those are the ones that I'm thinking of at this exact moment. Next, I love paranormal romance. I tend to get my paranormal romances on my Kindle, so I don't have hard copy books. So Carrie Cole is probably my favorite recent read. She wrote Hunt the Moon and Touch the Sky, and they are shifter romances, and I loved them. I don't tend to read romances more than once, but I read Touch the Sky twice because it was so good. And I am waiting for Talia Hibbert to write another paranormal romance because Mating the Huntress was fantastic. And I would like another book like that, please, preferably in that series. Please. Okay, next I read fantasy romance. And this book right here is probably one of my favorite books of all time. I've read it 3 times, Son of the Shadows by Juliette Marlier. If you are not reading Juliette Marlier and you like fantasy and you like romance, you need to read her. She is fantastic. She's a New Zealand author, I believe. She either lives in New Zealand or Australia. I can't remember where she lives now, but her books are so good. They're so good, and they're family sagas. So this one takes place in medieval Ireland. It's the second in the Seven Waters series, which is fantastic. Honestly, I do not think I've read a bad book by Juliette Marlier. They are a little slow to get into. They're very character driven. They are so beautiful though. Pick it up. They're also kind of long, but they are definitely worth it. Yeah, this one's like 460 pages, which is a little long for a romance, but not too long for a fantasy. And I think that they're mostly shelved in fantasy, but they all have romantic elements and satisfying endings in terms of the romance. All right, and I do read some contemporary romance. I don't read a lot of rom-coms. That's just not really my cup of tea, but I like a good contemporary romance that is either kind of an easy, cozy read or has a little bit more angst. So again, I don't tend to buy these hardback, but I do read them a lot on my Kindles. Penny Reid is probably my favorite contemporary romance author. Her Winston Brothers series is fantastic. I haven't read everything she's written because, as I said, contemporary is probably the romance genre I read the least, but I read the whole Winston Brothers and I loved it. I've read a bit of her spinoff. She's like a spinoff mystery romance with Cletus and Jen that I've enjoyed. And yeah, give her a try. She's super fun. Next, my most read genre is probably fantasy after romance. My fantasy reading varies widely, so it's kind of hard for me to pin down exactly what kind of fantasy I like to read, but here's my favorite fantasy book, The Mists of Avalon. It's up there for favorite book of all time. It's a chunker. It is sort of a problematic book to have be your favorite because the author was a horrible person, but it's one of those books that I can't really leave in the past because it really shaped me as a reader and a writer. I've read this book several times and I wrote my senior thesis in college on it, so I can't really let it go. But I'd recommend grabbing a used copy if you can, or getting it from your library if you're interested. It's a feminist retelling of Arthurian legend, and it's well written. It's a very well written fantasy book. Recently I read City of Brass, which I really liked. It's a fantasy setting in the 1800s, but set in Cairo, and then you're in sort of a parallel universe where jinn are real, in terms of like genie jinn are real. It's very good. I haven't read the second book or the third book yet. I just read the first one this summer, but I'm looking forward to the rest of the series. Okay, so next is mystery, and I've gotten more into mysteries lately. I was into them when I was younger, stopped for a while, and now I'm getting back into them. My favorite mystery author is Carol Goodman, and this is her newest book, The Sea of Lost Girls. It was fantastic. Also, if you are a dark academia person, read this book. Read this book in January, February, because the winter descriptions in this are fantastic. I also have been reading some more cozies lately, which are fun. This I would not classify as a cozy mystery. It's a little scary. Not like terrifying because I'm a scaredy cat, but there are scary parts in it. It's not a cozy mystery. Okay, so I've also started reading some contemporary fiction lately and been enjoying it. And Once There Were Wolves was fantastic. As you can see, I am a member of Book of the Month. They do not sponsor me. Do you want to sponsor me? I'd love it. I love being a member of Book of the Month. It's really fun. But this book was a very good contemporary fiction. I would say there's aspects of it that are thriller-ish, mystery-ish. It does have some pretty serious trigger warnings in terms of description of sexual assault and animal abuse, but I very, very much enjoyed this book. It's about a woman who is reintroducing wolves into Scotland, into the wild, and she has a twin sister. And as you read the book, you find out that some really horrible things have happened to them in the past and how they're sort of dealing with it. Great read, very fast read. I read this in one day. It was one of those books I picked up in the morning and was finished before dinner. Fantastic read. Once There Were Wolves by Charlotte McConaghy. Okay, so next is historical fiction. I don't read a ton of historical fiction, but I always read a couple a year. My favorite historical fiction ever is The People of the Book by Geraldine Brooks. She is a fantastic author. I've read the majority of her books, but this one's my favorite. It follows the story of a Haggadah, which, if you're familiar, is a holy Jewish book used during Passover. It's framed by a story that's taking place during the unrest in Sarajevo in the early 90s, which, if you're my age, you remember. I'm just looking up to see the exact date, 1996. You get the framework of a woman who is trying to save the Haggadah out of Sarajevo, which is currently like basically a war zone. And then she finds little inconsistencies in the Haggadah, and each one of those tells a story. So you go back to Spain during the Spanish Inquisition, you're in Venice, you're in North Africa. It's a wonderful story. I would really recommend it. It is a heavy read though, because, you know, the history of the Jewish people in Europe is not a bright one, but it's a very good read. I would say this also borders on literary fiction. It's very much a book club book. I have read this book twice. I read it once in one day on my honeymoon, and then I recommended it for my book club, and everyone liked it, but they did feel it was a little heavy at points. All right, next I read some literary fiction. Not a ton, but I do enjoy literary fiction. I had to pick one I'd read recently because I don't read that much literary fiction, or if I do, it sort of straddles the line of whether or not it can be in a different genre, like People of the Book. That could also be historical fiction. The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, which came out this year, I loved, but is that literary fiction? Is it fantasy? I actually saw someone shelve it as philosophical fiction, which I actually think is probably the best genre for it, but it doesn't really exist as like a deeply rooted genre. So we're going with If We Were Villains, which I read recently and absolutely adored. If you like dark academia, if you like Shakespeare, if you were a literature nerd or a theater nerd at any point in your life, you would really like this book. It is not a fast read. I thoroughly enjoyed it, but it did take me probably like 10 days to read the whole thing because the language is a little bit dense at times. A lot of the characters speak in Shakespeare lines. Large portions of the book are the characters acting out Shakespeare, so you don't really have to be familiar with Shakespeare, but you do have to be willing to read language written in Shakespeare's time, basically. If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. Very good. All right, now we'll do my sometimes read genres. So these are genres that I'm going to read 1 or 2 books a year, except next year I'm planning to read more in one of them. The first is sci-fi. I don't read sci-fi that often. I was working at an indie bookstore in the young adult department during the Hunger Games bananas business, which I have a really good Hunger Games story, which maybe I'll do a video later about all the cool authors I've gotten to meet over my life. But I kind of had too much post-apocalyptic, too much sci-fi. So sometimes my book club will read a sci-fi and then I'll read one, which if we do this year, I will talk to you about it, but I'm not terribly into reading sci-fi. I do currently have a sci-fi book on the hold at the library, which I will be getting very soon though, so you'll get a review on that one, probably in October. And the next genre that I read sometimes is classics. Now I am planning to read a lot more classics in 2022. This year I read Persuasion by Jane Austen, and I'm planning on reading Northanger Abbey this fall because that will round out my entire Jane Austen reading. I will have read all of it, minus the Watsons and Lady Susan, which I never read those two, but maybe I'll read those eventually. Favorite classic is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. I did not read this in school. I read a lot of great classics in school, but I did not read this in school, and I had always thought that it would be something I loved. And then I saw a preview of the TV movie with Halle Berry for Their Eyes Were Watching God, and was like, I need to buy that book. I need to read that book. I'm gonna love that book. And I did. It was fantastic. If you like classics that aren't written by old white guys who are probably British or American, this is a really good read. For adults, lastly, let's do what I don't read. I do not read horror because I am a very big scaredy cat. I really can't read anything terrifying. Now, I can read Frankenstein and Dracula. I've read both of those books a long time ago and I was fine. But like, I can't read stuff about like serial killers. It's way too scary for me. So don't recommend horror to me. And sadly, you're not gonna see, like, my October reading list is not gonna be full of gruesome horror. If you really need a horror recommendation, one of my good friends who's a writer reads a lot of horror and I can grab one from her for you. And secondly, which is odd because it's basically the polar opposite of horror, is that I don't really read chick lit women's fiction type stories. If I'm gonna read a story similar to that, I want there to be a romance in it and I want the guarantee that it's gonna end happily and that it's not gonna end on a low note. I think this partially stems from when I worked at an independent bookstore. The type of women's fiction and chick lit that was coming out was really uninteresting to me. That doesn't mean I won't find one this year and read it and like it. It's just not something I usually pick up. Considering there's so many books that I want to read, I don't tend to pick up like a chick lit type book that I just don't have that much interest in. Moving on to kids. For kids books, I will do a lot of picture books, a lot of early readers, and some middle grade. I don't really have like a specific genres in any of those. I have my picture books. I get whatever looks beautiful and whatever looks interesting to my kids. Same with kids nonfiction. Early readers, same deal. Middle grade, I personally tend to like fantasy, historical, and contemporary middle grade. Every once in a while, there's a great middle grade mystery that I'll pick up. These books that I get and read are mostly gonna be books that I'm reading with my kids. My kids are 8, 5, and then I have twin 3-year-olds. So the 8-year-olds just starting off the middle grade, and then the younger kids are doing the early chapter and picture books still. I do not read a ton of young adult, and that is mostly because I read too much young adult at one of my old jobs, and now I don't enjoy it very much. but I do have some young adult on my wish list, which if I do get a hankering to read, I will. If I'm gonna read young adult, it's probably gonna be fantasy. I'm not a huge contemporary young adult person, though as I say that, I've read some fantastic contemporary young adult that I would recommend forever, but they're not really, it's not really what I'm interested in reading right now. I do have a great knowledge of young adult that was published between the years 2006 and 2010. And that's basically it. Thank you for watching my intro video on what I'll be reading and recommending on here. I hope you're having a wonderful, cozy day. If you liked this video, if you liked me, if you're my friend in real life, like and subscribe please down there. And I hope you're having a wonderful, cozy day. Bye.